They called us rats, not as an insult, as a compliment, because in Stalingrad, being a rat meant being alive. I am Sergeant Viktor Petrov, and I spent 147 days fighting room to room in a city that became the graveyard of two armies. What you're about to hear is not from the history books. This is about killing a man so close you can smell his breath, about drinking from puddles mixed with blood. This is the Rattenkrieg, the Rat War, and how I survived it.
The train that brought us to Stalingrad stopped 20 kilometers outside the city because the tracks had been destroyed by German bombs. We could see the glow on the horizon, not the orange of sunset, but the deep red of a city burning. Even from that distance we could hear it, a continuous rumble like thunder that never stopped, punctuated by sharper cracks that made even the veterans among us flinch. We were replacements, most of us, sent to fill the gaps in divisions that had been chewed up and spit out by the German war machine. I was 22 years old. I had been a factory worker in Sverdlovsk before the war, making parts for tractors that were now being turned into parts for tanks. When my conscription notice came in June 1942, my mother cried for 3 days. My father, who had fought in the Civil War, simply nodded and handed me his old tobacco pouch. "You will need something to trade," he said. Those were his last words to me. He died of pneumonia that winter while I was fighting in the rubble of Stalingrad. I did not learn of his death until March. We marched through the night toward the burning horizon. The road was clogged with refugees moving in the opposite direction, old women carrying impossible bundles, children with eyes that had seen too much, wounded soldiers being carried on stretchers or limping along with makeshift crutches. One man, both his hands wrapped in bloody bandages, stopped and stared at us as we passed. "Turn around," he said. "Turn around while you still can. There is nothing left, nothing but death." A political officer struck him across the face and ordered us to keep moving. By dawn, we had reached the outskirts of the city. What I saw made me stop in my tracks. The soldier behind me walked into my back and cursed, but I could not move. I had seen photographs of ruined cities before, in newspapers and newsreels, but nothing had prepared me for this. Stalingrad was not a city anymore. It was a skeleton. The buildings had no roofs, no windows, often no walls. They were just hollow shells blackened by fire, their insides spilling out into the streets like the entrails of gutted animals. The smell hit us next. Smoke, cordite, and something sweeter and more terrible underneath. The smell of rotting flesh. Human flesh. It would become so familiar to me in the coming month that I would stop noticing it. But that first morning, it made several men in my company vomit. We were assigned to the 284th Rifle Division under Colonel Nikolai Bachuk, a stocky Ukrainian with a scarf that ran from his left ear to his chin. He had received it fighting the Whites in the Civil War, and he was proud of it. He gathered us replacements in the basement of what had once been a school, the only part of the building still standing, and addressed us with words I will never forget. "Welcome to Stalingrad," his voice flat and hard. "Forget everything you learned in training. Forget the tactics, forget the formations, forget the proper way to hold your rifle. None of that matters here. Here, there is only one rule: kill Germans. Kill them with bullets. Kill them with grenades, kill them with your bayonet, with rocks and bricks, with your bare hands if you have to. But kill them. Every German you kill is one less German trying to kill you. Every building you hold is one less building they can use to shoot at your comrades. Every meter of rubble you defend is one more meter of Mother Russia they have not conquered." He paused and looked at each of us in turn. "Many of you will die. Perhaps most of you.
But those of you who survive will have the honor of knowing you fought at Stalingrad. You will be able to tell your children and your grandchildren that you stood against the fascist beast and did not break. That is worth dying for. Now go find your units and prepare to fight. That night, September 15th, 1942, I killed my first German. My squad had been assigned to defend a section of warehouse buildings near the Volga ferry crossing. The crossing was crucial. It was how supplies and reinforcement reached the city, and the Germans were desperate to cut it off. They attacked at dusk, coming through the smoke in groups of 10 and 20, their helmets distinctive even in the fading light. I was positioned in the second floor of a warehouse that had once stored grain. Now it stored nothing but rubble, dust, and frightened young men with rifles. The German came through a hole in the wall that had been blown open by artillery. He was young, maybe even younger than me, with blonde hair and a face that might have been handsome before the war ground all the humanity out of it. He was carrying a submachine gun, an MP-40, and he was scanning the room for targets. He did not see me crouched behind a pile of bricks in the corner. I had a clear shot. My hands were shaking so badly that I was certain I would miss. I thought of my mother, my father, my younger sister Katya. I thought of the political officers' words about the motherland and the need to destroy fascism. But mostly, I thought about the simple fact that if I did not kill this man, he would kill me. I squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against my shoulder. The German's head snapped back and he crumpled to the floor. Blood began to pool beneath him, black in the dim light. I stared at him for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then another German appeared in the hall, and I fired again, and again, and again. By the time the attack was over, I had killed 4 men, and I felt nothing at all. That was my first lesson of Stalingrad. Feelings are a luxury soldiers cannot afford.
The days that followed blurred together into an endless nightmare of combat, exhaustion, and death. We learned quickly that Stalingrad was unlike any battle that had come before. The front lines were not lines at all. They were three-dimensional mazes that ran through buildings, across rooftops, down into cellars and sewers. You could be facing Germans on the floor above you, below you, and on either side of you simultaneously. A building that was in Soviet hands in the morning might be German by noon, and Soviet again by nightfall. Sometimes different floors of the same building would be held by opposing forces, and you would hear the enemy walking around above your head, speaking in their harsh language, and you would wait for the right moment to put a grenade through the ceiling. This was the essence of the Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. The Germans gave it that name, and they hated it. They were trained for open warfare, for blitzkrieg tactics that relied on tanks and aircraft and swift movement. In Stalingrad, their tanks were death traps. They could not maneuver in the narrow streets clogged with rubble, and they made easy targets for our anti-tank rifles and Molotov cocktails. Their aircraft, which had terrorized Poland and France and the open steppes of Russia, were almost useless in a city where the front line was sometimes measured in meters. The Luftwaffe could not bomb us without bombing their own men. So they had to fight like we did, on foot, with rifles and grenades and knives, room by room, and corpse by corpse. And they were not as good at it as we were. Not because they were worse soldiers. They were well trained and well equipped and brave in their own way, but because they were not as desperate as we were. They were fighting to conquer a city. We were fighting to save our homeland, our families, our very existence. There is a difference. I remember one German prisoner we captured in late September. He was a sergeant, an older man who had fought in Poland and France and the early campaigns in Russia. He was wounded in the leg and could not escape when we overran his position. We were supposed to send prisoners to the rear for interrogation, but the political officer who was with us decided to question him first. The German spoke some Russian, not to understand what we were asking. "Why do you keep fighting?" the political officer demanded. "You must know you cannot win. You are surrounded, your supplies are running out, winter is coming. Why not surrender and live?" The German laughed, a bitter sound that ended in a cough. "Surrender to you Bolsheviks? We know what you do to prisoners. We have seen the bodies. Besides, we cannot surrender. The Führer has ordered us to hold Stalingrad at all costs. Stalingrad bears Stalin's name. To give up Stalingrad would be to admit that Germany can be beaten. So we will fight until we are all dead, and so will you." The political officer shot him in the head. He was right about one thing. We will fight until we are all dead, but we will not be the ones who die first. October brought the cold. Not the deep freeze of true winter, not yet, but a creeping chill that seeped into your bones and never left. The nights grew longer and darker. The Germans launched attack after attack, trying to push us into the river, but we held. We held because we had no choice. Behind us was the Volga, and behind the Volga was nothing. If we fell, Stalingrad fell. If Stalingrad fell, the Germans would control the river, and they would be able to cut off the oil fields of the Caucasus Mountains. Without oil, our tanks and trucks and planes would be useless. The war would be lost. We understood this, every one of us, from the generals to the lowest private. This was not a fight we could afford to lose. So we held. My unit was assigned to defend a complex of factory buildings in the northern part of the city, the Red October steel plant, the Barricade weapons factory, and the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory. These massive structures had been the pride of Soviet manufacturing. Now they were fortresses, their massive structures providing cover and defensive positions that we exploited to the fullest. The fighting in the factory district was some of the most savage of the entire battle. I remember the Red October plant especially. It was a maze of machinery, catwalks, pipes, and storage rooms. The Germans would attack one section while we counterattacked another. Sometimes we would be fighting in the same building for days, neither side being able to gain a decisive advantage. The dead piled up, ours and theirs, and we had no time to bury them. We simply piled them against the walls or pushed them out of the way to make room for the living. The smell was unimaginable. Rats, real rats, not us soldier rats, grew fat and bold on the endless supply of corpses. They would scurry over your legs while you slept, and you learned to ignore them because killing rats was a waste of ammunition. There was a German sniper who operated in a factory district. We called him the Ghost because no one ever saw him, only the results of his work. He killed 17 men in my company over the course of 2 weeks. You would be walking along a corridor, trying to stay low and move fast, and suddenly the man next to you would be falling with a hole in his head. The crack of the rifle would come a fraction of a second later, but by then the Ghost was already repositioning for his next kill. Our own snipers tried to find him. We had some excellent marksmen, including a young woman named Tonya Ivanovna, who had been a university student before the war. She had killed over 50 Germans by that point, many of them officers and machine gunners. But the Ghost was clever. He never fired from the same position twice. He varied his timing and his targets. He seemed to know where we would be before we knew ourselves. Finally, we decided to set a trap. We placed a mannequin made from an old uniform stuffed with straw and topped with a helmet in a window. Then Tonya positioned herself in a concealed spot with a clear view of the likely sniper positions. We waited. It took 3 days. On the 3rd day, the Ghost took the bait. He fired at the mannequin, and in the split second before he could relocate, Tonya fired back. Her bullet caught him in the throat. When we recovered his body, we found he was a middle-aged man with gray hair and a family photograph in his pocket. A wife and 3 children, smiling in front of a house with a red roof. I wondered if they knew he was dead. I wondered if they would ever know what had happened to him. Tanya was killed a week later by a mortar shell. She never knew it was coming. One moment she was there, checking her rifle, and the next moment she was gone. Just a red smear on the factory floor. I helped collect what remained of her body for burial. There was not much. The rats had been at it already.
By November, the situation had become critical. The Germans held 90% of the city. We were squeezed into a few pockets along the riverbank, some only a few hundred meters deep. The ferry crossings were under constant fire. Supplies were running low. Ammunition, food, medicine, everything was rationed. We ate whatever we could find. Rats, dogs, horses killed by shell fire, frozen potatoes dug from the ruins of bombed-out cellars. I once traded half my tobacco ration for a handful of grain that had been swept up from the floor of the ruined warehouse I mentioned earlier. It was mixed with dirt and sawdust, but I boiled it into a thin gruel that kept me alive for another day. The nights were the worst. The Germans attacked during the day, but at night they settled into their positions and waited for dawn. We could hear them talking, laughing sometimes, singing songs. They were so close, sometimes only a wall or a floor separated us from them, and yet they might as well have been on another planet. They were the enemy, the fascists, the invaders. They had killed my friends, destroyed my country, and threatened everything I loved. And yet, sometimes in the dark, listening to some young German soldier singing a song about his home and his mother, I would feel a strange kinship with him. We were all just men, caught up in a madness we could not control, doing what we were told because we had no other choice. Then dawn would come, and the killing would start again, and I would remember that kinship was a luxury I could not afford. The political officers worked hard to keep our spirits up. They held meetings where they read letters from workers in the factories back home, encouraging us to fight on. They distributed newspapers with stories of German atrocities, as if we needed reminding of what we were fighting against, and accounts of Soviet successes on other fronts. They reminded us constantly of the immortal words attributed to Vasily Zaitsev, though I never heard him say them myself. There is no land for us beyond the Volga. It became our mantra, our prayer. There is no land beyond the Volga. We fight here or we die here. There is nowhere else to go. I believed it. We all believed it. Believing it was what kept us fighting when every rational part of our minds told us that the situation was hopeless. But the situation was not hopeless. What we did not know, what the Germans did not know, was that something massive was being prepared. Operation Uranus, the Soviet counteroffensive that would change the course of the war. While we fought and bled and died in the ruins of Stalingrad, hundreds of thousands of fresh troops were being assembled to the north and south. Tanks, artillery, cavalry, all gathering in secret, waiting for the signal to attack. The signal came on November 19th, 1942. I heard the artillery barrage that marked the beginning of the offensive. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Thousands of guns firing in unison, a rolling thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. We did not know what it meant at first. We thought the Germans were launching another massive attack. Then word came down from the officers the counteroffensive had begun. Soviet forces were attacking the Romanian and Hungarian armies guarding the German flanks. The Germans were being encircled. For the first time in months, I felt something like hope.
The encirclement was completed on November 23, 1942. The German Sixth Army, over 300,000 men strong, was trapped inside Stalingrad. Now they were the ones who were surrounded. Now they were the ones running out of supplies. The hunters had become the hunted. But the fighting was far from over. The Germans refused to surrender. They were promised resupply by air, a promise that turned out to be empty, as the Luftwaffe could not deliver enough supplies to sustain an army that size. They were promised relief from the outside, a promise that also proved false, as our forces stopped the relief attempt at the Mishkova River. Still they fought on, dying by the thousands from cold and hunger and Soviet bullets. And we fought on too. The street battles continued, even more intense than before. The Germans were desperate now, fighting not for victory, but for survival. A desperate enemy is a dangerous enemy. They counterattacked with the ferocity of cornered animals, and every block we took cost us dearly. I lost more friends in those weeks than in all the previous months combined. There was Sasha, my closest friend in the unit, a foreign boy from the Ukraine who used to tell jokes to keep our spirits up. He was killed by a grenade on December 3rd. There was Lieutenant Dmitri, our platoon leader, a tough old soldier who had fought in Finland and was said to be unkillable. A German machine gunner proved that rumor wrong on December 10th. There was the boy we called Little Petya, only 17 years old, who should not have been in the army at all. He stepped on a mine on December 15th and died screaming for his mother. I stopped learning the names of new replacements. It was easier that way. They would be dead soon anyway, and every name I learned was another wound in my heart. I became hard and cold, a killing machine that felt nothing and feared nothing. That was the only way to survive. December turned into January. The cold was now truly brutal, temperatures plunging to 30 below zero. Frostbite claimed almost as many casualties as bullets. Men's fingers and toes turned black and fell off. Weapons froze solid and refused to fire. We had to urinate on our rifles to keep the mechanisms from seizing up. The Germans had it even worse. They had not prepared for a Russian winter. Their summer uniforms were useless, and the promised winter gear never arrived. They stripped the dead, ours and theirs, for any extra clothing they could find. They slaughtered their horses for meat and burned anything that would burn to stay warm. I once found a German position that had been abandoned in mid-January. The soldiers there had died not from Soviet bullets, but from cold and hunger. They were frozen in place like statues, their faces blue and their eyes open. One man was still holding a photograph of a woman. Another had his hands clasped as if in prayer. A third had shot himself. His pistol was still in his hand, and there was a frozen stray of blood and brains on the wall behind him. I felt no satisfaction at the sight, only a profound weariness. This was what war did to men. This was what we had all become.
The end came in early February. On January 30th, Hitler promoted Friedrich Paulus to field marshal, apparently expecting him to commit suicide rather than surrender. No German field marshal had ever been captured alive. Paulus disappointed him. On January 31st, the southern pocket of German resistance surrendered. Paulus himself was taken prisoner, the highest-ranking German officer ever captured by Soviet forces. The northern pocket held out for 2 more days. When they finally surrendered on February 2nd, 1943, the Battle of Stalingrad was over. Of the 300,000 German soldiers who had been trapped in the encirclement, over 100,000 were dead.
The remaining 91,000 surrendered. Most of them would die in Soviet prisoner of war camps. Only about 5,000 would ever see Germany again. I was there when one group of German prisoners was marched through the ruins. They were pitiful figures, skeletal, frostbitten, wrapped in rags, barely able to walk. Many had to be supported by their comrades. Some collapsed and did not get up again. The guards simply left them where they fell. There was no mercy to spare for the invaders who had killed so many of us. I watched them pass and felt nothing. No hatred, no triumph, no compassion. Just emptiness. The battle was over, but so was something inside me. The young man who had arrived in Stalingrad 5 months earlier, full of fear and determination and belief in the cause, was gone. In his place was something harder, darker, a survivor who had learned that the only law in war is survival and the only truth is death. The city we had fought so hard to defend was destroyed, completely, utterly destroyed. Before the war, Stalingrad had been home to over 500,000 people. It had factories and schools and theaters and parks. It had streetcars and markets and apartment buildings where families lived and loved and dreamed of the future. Now it was a wasteland of rubble and ash. Not a single building was left standing intact. Not a street was passable. The civilian population was gone, evacuated, fled, or dead. The only inhabitants were soldiers and corpses. I wandered through the ruins after the surrender, trying to find something, I did not know what. Some sign of the city that had been, perhaps. Some evidence that this had once been a place where people lived normal lives. But there was nothing, just ruins and bodies and the stench of death. I found a child's doll in the wreckage of what had once been an apartment building. It was a simple thing, made of cloth, with button eyes and yarn hair. It had been burnt on one side and the stuffing was coming out, but someone had loved it once. Some little girl had held it close and whispered secrets to it and taken it to bed at night. I wondered what had happened to her. Was she safe, evacuated to somewhere beyond the reach of the war? Or was she buried beneath the rubble I was standing on, still holding on to her doll? I kept the doll. I do not know why. It served no practical purpose, but I tucked it into my pack and carried it with me for the rest of the war. It became a kind of talisman, a reminder of the innocent lives that had been destroyed by this madness, and perhaps also a reminder of the innocent young man I had been before Stalingrad changed me forever. The aftermath of the battle was strange and anticlimactic. After months of constant fighting, the silence was almost unbearable. We had become so accustomed to the sounds of war, the explosions, the gunfire, the screaming, that their absence felt like a kind of deafness. Men who had not slept properly in months suddenly found they could not sleep at all. The adrenaline that had kept us going had nowhere to go. Some men became giddy, laughing and joking and celebrating. Others, like me, simply sat in stunned silence, trying to process what we had survived. We were given a few days of rest before being assigned to new units and new fronts. The war was not over. It would continue for another 2 years, but Stalingrad had broken the back of the German offensive. Never again would they threaten the heart of the Soviet Union. Never again would they come so close to victory. From Stalingrad, the long road to Berlin began. I was decorated for my service in the battle. The medal meant nothing to me. I had done what any man would do to survive. I had killed because killing was necessary. I had endured because endurance was the only option. There was no heroism in that, only desperation.
The true heroes were the ones who had not survived, the ones who had given their lives so that others might live, so that the city might be held, so that the motherland might be saved. But the medal looked good on my uniform, and the political officers used men like me for propaganda purposes. We were paraded in front of cameras and asked to talk about our experiences for the newsreels. I said what I was supposed to say about the glory of the Red Army, the evil of fascism, the certain victory of socialism. The words felt hollow in my mouth, but I spoke them anyway. What else could I do? The war continued. I fought at Kursk, where the greatest tank battle in history broke the last German offensive. I fought at the crossing of the Dnieper, where we liberated the Ukraine from German occupation. I fought through Poland and into Germany itself. I was wounded twice more, once in the arm, once in the leg, but neither wound was serious enough to send me home. I became a lieutenant, then a captain. I commanded men and sent them to their deaths, just as my commanders had sent me to what should have been my death at Stalingrad. I was in Berlin when the war finally ended in May 1945. I was there when the Soviet flag was raised over the Reichstag. I should have felt triumph, joy, relief. Instead, I felt only exhaustion. The war that had consumed 4 years of my life was over, and I had survived. But so many others had not. My friend Sasha, Lieutenant Dmitri, little Petya, Tanya the sniper, and millions more whose names I never knew. They were all gone, and I was still here. Why? What made me worthy of survival when so many better men and women had died?
The end came in early February. On January 30th, Hitler promoted Friedrich Paulus to field marshal, apparently expecting him to commit suicide rather than surrender. No German field marshal had ever been captured alive. Paulus disappointed him. On January 31st, the southern pocket of German resistance surrendered. Paulus himself was taken prisoner, the highest-ranking German officer ever captured by Soviet forces. The northern pocket held out for 2 more days. When they finally surrendered on February 2nd, 1943, the Battle of Stalingrad was over. Of the 300,000 German soldiers who had been trapped in the encirclement, over 100,000 were dead. The remaining 91,000 surrendered. Most of them would die in Soviet prisoner-of-war camps. Only about 5,000 would ever see Germany again. I was there when one group of German prisoners was marched through the ruins. They were pitiful figures, skeletal, frostbitten, wrapped in rags, barely able to walk. Many had to be supported by their comrades. Some collapsed and did not get up again. The guards simply left them where they fell. There was no mercy to spare for the invaders who had killed so many of us. I watched them pass and felt nothing. No hatred, no triumph, no compassion. Just emptiness. The battle was over, but so was something inside me. The young man who had arrived in Stalingrad 5 months earlier, full of fear and determination and belief in the cause, was gone. In his place was something harder, darker, a survivor who had learned that the only law in war is survival, and the only truth is death. The city we had fought so hard to defend was destroyed. Completely, utterly destroyed. Before the war, Stalingrad had been home to over 500,000 people. It had factories and schools and theaters and parks. It had streetcars and markets and apartment buildings where families lived and loved and dreamed of the future. Now it was a wasteland of rubble and ash. Not a single building was left standing intact. Not a street was passable. The civilian population was gone, evacuated,
fled or dead. The only inhabitants were soldiers and corpses. I wandered through the ruins after the surrender, trying to find something, I did not know what. Some sign of the city that had been, perhaps. Some evidence that this had once been a place where people lived normal lives. But there was nothing, just ruins and bodies and the stench of death. I found a child's doll in the wreckage of what had once been an apartment building. It was a simple thing, made of cloth, with button eyes and yarn hair. It had been burnt on one side and the stuffing was coming out, but someone had loved it once. Some little girl had held it close and whispered secrets to it and taken it to bed at night. I wondered what had happened to her. Was she safe, evacuated to somewhere beyond the reach of the war? Or was she buried beneath the rubble I was standing on, still holding on to her doll? I kept the doll. I do not know why. It served no practical purpose, but I tucked it into my pack and carried it with me for the rest of the war. It became a kind of talisman, a reminder of the innocent lives that had been destroyed by this madness, and perhaps also a reminder of the innocent young man I had been before Stalingrad changed me forever. The aftermath of the battle was strange and anticlimactic. After months of constant fighting, the silence was almost unbearable. We had become so accustomed to the sounds of war, the explosions, the gunfire, the screaming, that their absence felt like a kind of deafness. Men who had not slept properly in months suddenly found they could not sleep at all. The adrenaline that had kept us going had nowhere to go. Some men became giddy, laughing and joking and celebrating. Others, like me, simply sat in stunned silence, trying to process what we had survived. We were given a few days of rest before being assigned to new units and new fronts. The war was not over. It would continue for another 2 years, but Stalingrad had broken the back of the German offensive. Never again would they threaten the heart of the Soviet Union. Never again would they come so close to victory. From Stalingrad, the long road to Berlin began. I was decorated for my service in the battle. The medal meant nothing to me. I had done what any man would do to survive. I had killed because killing was necessary. I had endured because endurance was the only option. There was no heroism in that, only desperation. The true heroes were the ones who had not survived, the ones who had given their lives so that others might live, so that the city might be held, so that the motherland might be saved. But the medal looked good on my uniform, and the political officers used men like me for propaganda purposes. We were paraded in front of cameras and asked to talk about our experiences for the newsreels. I said what I was supposed to say about the glory of the Red Army, the evil of fascism, the certain victory of socialism. The words felt hollow in my mouth, but I spoke them anyway. What else could I do? The war continued. I fought at Kursk, where the greatest tank battle in history broke the last German offensive. I fought at the crossing of the Dnieper, where we liberated the Ukraine from German occupation. I fought through Poland and into Germany itself. I was wounded twice more, once in the arm, once in the leg, but neither wound was serious enough to send me home. I became a lieutenant, then a captain. I commanded men and sent them to their deaths, just as my commanders had sent me to what should have been my death at Stalingrad. I was in Berlin when the war finally ended in May 1945. I was there when the Soviet flag was raised over the Reichstag. I should have felt triumph, joy, relief. Instead, I felt only exhaustion. The war that had consumed 4 years of my life was over, and I had survived. But so many others had not. My friend Sasha, Lieutenant Dmitri, little Petya, Tanya the sniper, and millions more whose names I never knew. They were all gone, and I was still here. Why? What made me worthy of survival when so many better men and women had died?
I want to tell you about some of the people I fought alongside in Stalingrad, because they deserve to be remembered, not as statistics in the history book, but as the living, breathing human beings they were before the war ground them up and spat them out. There was Sergeant Ivan Mikhailovich Kuznetsov, who we called the Bear, because of his enormous size and strength. He was a dock worker from Leningrad before the war, used to loading and unloading ships on the Neva. In Stalingrad, he became famous for his ability to carry wounded men to safety through fire that would have killed anyone else. He seemed impervious to bullets. They would hit him, and he would simply grunt and keep going. He saved at least 20 lives that I personally witnessed, probably many more. The Bear survived Stalingrad, but he was killed at Kursk the following summer, a direct hit from an 88mm shell. There was not enough left of him to bury. There was Private Alexei Stepanovich Volkov, a musician from Moscow who had played violin in an orchestra before the war. He was a gentle soul, completely unsuited to combat, and he should have been assigned to an entertainment unit or a hospital. Instead, some bureaucratic error sent him to the front lines of Stalingrad. He was terrified constantly, and he cried every night after battles. But he never ran, never shirked his duty, never let his comrades down. He killed Germans alongside the rest of us, even though every kill tore another piece from his gentle heart. Alexei survived Stalingrad, but he was never the same. After the war, he could not play violin anymore. His hand shook too badly. He became a clerk in a government office and drank himself to death by 1952. There was Corporal Yuri Andreevich Sokolov, a farm boy from the Volga region, who had never been more than 50 kilometers from his village before the war. He was simple and kind and absolutely fearless. He once crawled across 50 meters of open ground under German machine gun fire to retrieve a wounded officer. When asked why he did it, he shrugged and said the officer needed help, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Yuri was killed in December, shot by a sniper while he was helping distribute rations. The bullet went through his eye and out the back of his head. He was dead before he hit the ground. There was Lieutenant Natasha Petrovna Zhukov, one of the many women who served in combat roles at Stalingrad. She commanded a platoon of anti-aircraft gunners who were often pressed into ground combat when the Germans attacked. She was fierce and competent and absolutely ruthless. I once saw her execute a German prisoner who had tried to grab her weapon. She shot him in the face without hesitation, then went back to directing her gunners as if nothing had happened. Natasha survived the war and became a party official afterwards. I heard she rose quite high in the bureaucracy. I always wondered if she too was haunted by what she had done and seen, but we never spoke of such things. There was Private Boris Ivanovich Popov, the oldest man in my unit at 43. He had served in the Tsar's army in the Great War and had been a prisoner of the Germans for 2 years before escaping. He knew things about the Germans that were useful, their tactics, their psychology, their weaknesses. He also knew things about suffering and survival that only a man who has been through hell can know. Boris was a steadying presence in our unit, the calm voice of experience when younger men were panicking. He survived Stalingrad and Kursk and the drive into Germany. He was killed in Berlin just 3 days before the war ended by a 16-year-old Hitler youth with a Panzerfaust. The irony was not lost on those of us who survived. There was Private Semyon Nikolaevich Orlov, who we called the Scholar, because he had been a university student before the war, studying literature and philosophy. He would quote Pushkin and Tolstoy in the middle of firefights, shouting lines of poetry as he loaded his rifle. We thought he was mad, but his madness was infectious.
It reminded us that we were still human beings, that somewhere beyond the rubble and the blood there was still beauty and meaning in the world. Semyon was wounded in October and evacuated across the Volga. I never learned if he survived the war. I like to think he did, that somewhere an old man who once fought at Stalingrad is still quoting Pushkin to his grandchildren. There were so many others, men and women whose names I have forgotten, but whose faces are burned into my memory. The young boy who died in my arms, asking for his mother. The old soldier who gave me his last cigarette before the battle that killed him. The nurse who crawled through fire to bandage my wounds when I was hit. The political officer who was shot in the back by his own men. I never learned who did it, and I never asked. The German soldier I bayoneted in hand-to-hand fight, whose eyes I still see in my nightmares. The friend who saved my life by pushing me out of the way of a grenade, taking the shrapnel that was meant for me. They all deserve to be remembered. They all deserve more than a few sentences in an old man's rambling memoir. But this is all I can give them. Words on a page, fading memories of people who once lived and loved and hoped and feared, and who are now nothing but dust and bones scattered across the steppes of Russia. The Battle of Stalingrad was the largest and bloodiest battle in human history. Over 2 million people fought in it. Nearly 2 million were killed, wounded, or captured. The numbers are so large that they become meaningless, abstract figures that the mind cannot process. But each of those numbers was a person. Each had a name, a face, a story. Each left behind parents, siblings, children, friends. Each was loved by someone, and each left a void that could never be filled. I think about that sometimes. I think about the German soldiers I killed. How many were there? 20, 30, more? I lost count. Each of those men was someone's son. Some of them were someone's husband, someone's father. They had hopes and dreams and people who loved them. And I ended their lives because they were wearing the wrong uniform and standing on the wrong side of the front line. I do not feel guilty about killing them. They were the enemy, the invaders, the destroyers of my homeland. If I had not killed them, they would have killed me and my comrades. That is the logic of war, simple and terrible and inescapable. But I feel something, a heaviness perhaps, a weight that I carry with me always, the weight of all those lives I took, all those futures I ended, all those families I destroyed without ever knowing their names. War does that to you. It makes you a killer, and then it makes you live with what you have done. Some men cannot bear the weight. They drink themselves to death, like Alexei the musician. They put guns to their heads, like so many veterans I have known. They become hollow shells, walking through life but never really living it. Others find ways to cope: work, family, faith, the passage of time. I found writing. I wrote my way through the darkness, word by word, page by page, until the weight became bearable. Not lighter, never lighter, but bearable. And now I write for you, whoever you are, wherever you are, whenever you are reading this. I write so that you'll know what happened at Stalingrad. Not the version in the textbooks, not the propaganda, not the myths and legends. The truth, the dirty, bloody, terrible truth of what we did and what was done to us.
Remember us. Remember that we were young and frightened, and we did what we had to do. Remember that we suffered, and we died, and we survived. Remember that we were human beings, not heroes and not monsters, just ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances. Remember that war is not glorious or noble or heroic. It is filth and fear and the destruction of everything that makes life worth living. And remember that it can happen again, that the forces that led to Stalingrad, hatred, nationalism, the lust for power, the dehumanization of the enemy, are still present in the world.
that every generation must be vigilant against them, must remember the lessons of the past, must never allow the horror to be repeated. That is why I write. That is why I remember. That is why, even now, even as an old man waiting for death, I force myself to relive those terrible days, not for glory, not for recognition, but for truth, so that the dead will not be forgotten, so that their sacrifice will mean something, so that the future will be different from the past. There is no land for us beyond the Volga. That was our motto at Stalingrad. But now I understand it differently. There is no land beyond the Volga meant that we had nowhere to run, that we had to stand and fight where we were. But it also means something else to me now. It means that there is no escape from what we did, no way to cross to a different shore where the memories do not follow. The Volga of my past flows forever behind me, and I can never cross it. I can only stand on this bank and remember. I want to talk more about the specifics of the Rattenkrieg, the Rat War, because it was unlike anything that had come before in the history of warfare. The nature of urban combat in Stalingrad created conditions that no military theorist had ever imagined, and that would forever change the way armies thought about fighting in cities. The first thing you must understand is the intimacy of the combat. We were not fighting across open fields or from positions hundreds of meters apart. We were fighting in rooms, in hallways, in cellars, in stairwells. Sometimes the enemy was close enough to touch. Sometimes you could see the whites of their eyes, see the fear and hatred that mirrored your own. Sometimes you killed men so close that their blood splashed on your face. This kind of combat requires a different set of skills than conventional warfare. Marksmanship matters less than reflexes. Artillery is almost useless because you cannot shell the enemy without shelling yourself. Tanks are death traps in streets clogged with rubble. The weapons that matter are grenades, submachine guns, knives, entrenching tools, even bare hands. We learned to fight with whatever we had. I once killed a German with a brick because I had run out of ammunition and he had run out of ammunition, and we were both too exhausted to run. The tactics we developed were born of necessity. We learned to fight in Sturm groups, small self-sufficient units of 6 to 8 men, armed with a mix of weapons, rifles, submachine guns, grenades, sometimes a light machine gun. These groups would infiltrate enemy positions through sewers, through holes blasted in walls, through cellars and attics and any other route that offered concealment. Once inside, they would clear rooms one by one, throwing grenades first and shooting anything that moved afterwards. We learned to use the terrain to our advantage. A destroyed building might seem useless, but it could provide excellent defensive positions. Piles of rubble became improvised bunkers, cellars became command posts, sewers became highways for moving men and supplies without exposure to enemy fire. We became experts at camouflage and concealment, at moving silently through the ruins, at finding cover where there seemed to be none. We learned to fight at night as well as by day. In a city of multi-story buildings, control of the high ground was crucial. Whoever held the upper floors could fire down on the enemy below, could observe their movements, could direct artillery and mortar fire. So we fought for staircases and ladders and any means of ascending. And we learned to fight downward as well, dropping grenades through holes in floors, shooting through ceilings, bringing entire buildings down on the enemy. The Germans, to their credit, adapted to these conditions as well. They were professional soldiers, well-trained and experienced, and they learned quickly. Their storm groups were as deadly as ours. Their snipers were as skilled. Their tactics were as ruthless. That was why the fighting was so prolonged and so bloody, because both sides were evenly matched and neither was willing to give ground. The result was a battle of attrition, a slow grinding down of men and materiel that favored the side with the larger reserves. And that side was us. The Soviet Union had more men, more resources, more willingness to sacrifice. The Germans had started the war with the advantage of surprise and superior technology, but by Stalingrad those advantages had eroded. Now it was a contest of endurance, and we were more enduring. But the cost was terrible. The daily casualty rates at Stalingrad were unlike anything seen before or since. A fresh division sent to Stalingrad could expect to lose half its men within a week. Some divisions were virtually annihilated and had to be rebuilt from scratch multiple times. Individual soldiers had life expectancies measured in days, sometimes hours. The average survival time for a newly arrived soldier in the factories district was about 3 days. I survived because of luck. There is no other explanation. Bullets that should have hit me missed by inches. Shells that should have killed me landed meters away instead. Situations that should have been certain death somehow were not. I can point to no skill or virtue that kept me alive while so many others died. It was simply luck, random chance, the arbitrary hand of fate that chose me to live and others to die.
That is perhaps the hardest thing to accept about war, the randomness of death. You can do everything right, be the best soldier, the most careful and the most skilled, and still die because a mortar round happened to land on your position. Or you can be careless and stupid and somehow survive. There is no justice in it, no logic, no meaning. There is only chance. Some men find this liberating. If death is random, then there is no point worrying about it. You simply do your job and accept whatever comes. I knew soldiers who went through Stalingrad with a kind of fatalistic calm, never flinching, never panicking, because they had truly accepted that their lives were not in their own hands. They were the most effective fighters because fear did not hinder them. Others were destroyed by this randomness. They could not accept that their survival was a matter of luck, so they invented superstitions and rituals to create the illusion of control. They would wear lucky charms or say prayers before battle. They would follow elaborate routines that they believed kept them safe. When those routines failed, when the lucky charms did not work and the prayers went unanswered, they fell apart. I saw men break down completely, become gibbering wrecks, unable to function, because the randomness of death had finally broken through their defenses. I fell somewhere in between. I developed my own superstitions, the child's doll I carried, a certain way of checking my rifle before action, but I never truly believed in them. I knew they were just psychological tricks, ways of managing the fear who is always there, a constant companion. But I learned to function despite it, to do what needed to be done, to kill when killing was necessary, to survive from one moment to the next. And somehow, against all odds, I did survive. When the German surrender came in February 1943, I was still standing, wounded twice, sick with exhaustion and malnutrition, aged 10 years in 5 months, but alive. One of the lucky few who had entered the meat grinder and emerged from the other side. The immediate aftermath of the battle was surreal.
The silence, after months of constant noise, was almost unbearable. The stillness, after months of constant movement, was disorienting. We wandered through the ruins like ghosts, unable to believe that it was finally over. Some men laughed hysterically, others wept. Some simply sat down and stared at nothing, their minds unable to process the transition from war to peace. The cleanup took months. The bodies alone numbered in the hundreds of thousands, German and Soviet, soldier and civilian, all tangled together in the rubble. Many were never recovered. They simply became part of the ruins, buried under brick and concrete, their bones mixing with the dust of the city they had destroyed. Even today, I am told, construction crews in Volgograd, as Stalingrad was renamed in 1961, sometimes uncover human remains. The dead of Stalingrad are still being found, still being buried 80 years after the guns fell silent. The prisoners were marched away to camps deep in the Soviet interior. Most of them died there of cold and hunger and disease, and the simple fact that no one cared whether they lived or died. I have read German accounts of those camps written by the handful of survivors who made it back to Germany in the 1950s. They are terrible stories, full of suffering and cruelty and despair, but I cannot bring myself to feel much sympathy. They came to our country as conquerors. They burned our cities and murdered our people and tried to enslave our nation. What happened to them afterwards was, in some sense, justice. Though justice is a cold and empty word when applied to human suffering. The rebuilding of Stalingrad began almost immediately after the battle. It was a priority of the Soviet state, a symbol of our resilience and determination. Within a few years, the factories were operating again, the apartments were rebuilt, the streets were cleared. Today, Volgograd is a modern city of over 1 million people with all the amenities of 21st century urban life. But traces of the battle remain. The ruined walls of Pavlov's house, which a small group of soldiers held for 58 days against constant German attacks. The grain elevator, where fighting was so intense that bodies piled up to the second floor. The Mamayev kurgan, the hill that changed hands countless times and which is now crowned by an enormous statue called the Motherland Calls. I visited Volgograd once in 1985 for the 40th anniversary of the end of the war. It was strange to walk through streets that had once been battlefields, to see shops and apartments where I had killed men and watched friends die. The city had moved on, as cities do. The children playing in the parks had never known war. The young people going about their business had no memory of the horror that had happened there. Life goes on, always, even in the places that have seen the worst of human cruelty. I stood on Mamayev kurgan and looked out over the city and the river beyond. The Volga was calm and blue, beautiful in the afternoon light. It was hard to believe that this peaceful scene had once been the center of the greatest battle in human history. Hard to believe that the ground I was standing on was soaked with the blood of hundreds of thousands of men. Hard to believe that I had survived it all. There is no land for us beyond the Volga. We held to that principle and we held the city. But the land we were defending is transformed beyond recognition, and most of those who defended it are long gone. I am one of the last. When I close my eyes, I still see the Stalingrad of 1942, the burning buildings, the frozen corpses, the endless battle. That is the Stalingrad I will take with me to my grave. The real city, the modern Volgograd, is a stranger to me. It belongs to the living. The Stalingrad of memory belongs to the dead. I want to tell you about one particular day at Stalingrad because it captures something essential about the nature of the fighting there. It was November 11th, 1942, a week before the Soviet counteroffensive began, though of course we did not know that at the time. We were holding a section of the Red October plant, fighting off what seemed like endless German attacks. The day began before dawn with a German artillery barrage. The shells came down on our positions for 20 minutes, churning the rubble into finer rubble, collapsing walls and ceilings, burying men alive. You could do nothing during a barrage except huddle in the deepest shelter you could find and pray, or, if you were not a praying man, simply endure. The noise was so loud that you could not hear yourself think. The ground shook so hard that you could not stand. The dust was so thick that you could not see. You simply waited, knowing that each second could be your last, that any of those shells could have your name on it. When the barrage lifted, the German infantry attacked. They came in waves, emerging from the smoke and dust like ghosts, their gray uniforms blending with the gray rubble. We opened fire, cutting them down, but more kept coming. They reached our first line of defense and were repelled. They regrouped and attacked again. They reached our second line of defense and were repelled again. The cycle repeated over and over throughout the morning.
By noon, we had run low on ammunition. The supply route from the river was cut, and there would be no resupply until nightfall, if then. We were ordered to fix bayonets and hold at all costs. Fix bayonets. Those two words meant that we were expected to fight hand to hand, if necessary, to die in place rather than retreat. We fixed our bayonets and waited for the next attack. It came in the early afternoon, a larger force this time, maybe 2 companies, supported by machine guns and mortars. They advanced through the rubble, taking cover behind debris, moving in short rushes. We fired what ammunition we had, making every shot count. When our rifles were empty, we threw grenades. When the grenades were gone, we threw bricks and rocks. When there was nothing left to throw, we charged. I do not have clear memories of the hand-to-hand fighting. It exists in my mind as a series of fragments, a German face twisted in fear, a bayonet sliding into flesh, a spray of blood, a scream that might have been mine or someone else's. My body took over, all the training and instinct and desperate will to survive taking control, while my conscious mind retreated somewhere safe. When it was over, I was standing in a pile of bodies, my bayonet broken off in some German's chest, my hands covered in blood that was not all my own. We had held, at a terrible cost. More than half of my platoon was dead or wounded, but we had held. The Germans retreated, dragging their own casualties with them, and we collapsed in the rubble to wait for the next attack. It came again at dusk, and again at midnight, and again at dawn the next day. That was the rhythm of Stalingrad. Attack, repulse, day after day after day, with the only variation being which side was attacking and which was defending at any given moment. I have described November 11th, 1942, but I could have described almost any day during those terrible months. They all blurred together into one endless battle, one continuous nightmare from which there was no waking. The faces of the dead piled up in my memory until they became anonymous, interchangeable, just more victims of the great machine of war that crowned us all up, regardless of which uniform we wore. The fighting in the factories was some of the most brutal of the entire battle. The massive steel structures of the factories could withstand tremendous punishment. Shells that would have demolished ordinary buildings merely dented the thick steel walls.
This made the factories into almost impregnable fortresses, but also meant that taking them required infantry assaults that were incredibly costly. The factory floors became killing grounds. The open spaces between machinery offered little cover, and anyone caught in the open was cut down by enemy fire. So we learned to use the machines themselves as cover, to thread our way through the industrial landscape like mice through a complex maze. We learned which machines provided good protection and which were death traps. We learned the sounds of the factory, the settling of damaged structures, the drip of water from broken pipes, the scurrying of rats, and how to distinguish those sounds from the sounds of enemy movement. The basements of the factories became our homes. We slept there, ate there, planned there, died there. They were dark and damp and filled with the smell of oil and blood and unwashed bodies. But they were safe from artillery, and safety was the most precious commodity in Stalingrad. We fought all day and retreated to the basements at night, grabbing a few hours of sleep before the cycle began again. I remembered the constant presence of industrial debris. Gears and cogs and shafts and pipes, twisted and broken by the fighting, littered every surface. You learned to move carefully, because a misplaced step could send you tumbling down a shaft or impale you on a piece of machinery. More than one soldier died not from enemy action, but from the industrial hazards that surrounded us constantly. The machinery itself became part of the battle. We used fallen cranes as cover. We turned furnaces into strong points. We stretched cables across walkways to trap attacking soldiers. We sabotaged machines to fall on anyone who tried to pass beneath them. The factory that had once produced steel for the Soviet war effort now produced only death, an industrial killing machine operated by human hands. There were moments of strange beauty amid the horror. I remember watching the sparks from a burning building cascade down like fireworks against the night sky. I remembered the way the morning sun would catch the frost on the rubble, making it glitter like diamonds. I remember the sound of someone, somewhere, playing a harmonica, a plaintive melody that floated across the battlefield and reminded us that we were still human beings, capable of creating beauty. And there were moments of unexpected kindness. I remember sharing my last piece of bread with a wounded comrade. I remember a nurse risking her life to bring water to men trapped in a collapsed building. I remember soldiers going back into enemy fire to retrieve the bodies of fallen friends so that they could be buried properly. Even in the depths of hell, the human capacity for compassion survived. But mostly there was fear and pain and death. Mostly there was the constant struggle to survive one more hour, one more day, one more battle. Mostly there was the deafening noise and the suffocating dust and the ever-present smell of blood and rot. Mostly there was Stalingrad. The Germans gave us a name during the battle, Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. They meant it as a complaint, an expression of their frustration at fighting in conditions so alien to their training. But we took it as a badge of honor. We were the rats of Stalingrad, and we had learned to thrive in the darkness and the rubble. We could survive on scraps. We could move unseen through impossible spaces. We could strike from nowhere and disappear before the enemy could respond. The Germans were not prepared for the Rat War. Their army was built for sweeping movements across open terrain, for rapid advances supported by tanks and aircraft. In Stalingrad, all of that was useless. Their tanks were death traps in the narrow streets. Their aircraft could not distinguish friend from foe in the chaotic tangle of the front lines. Their carefully coordinated tactics fell apart in the confusion of room-to-room fighting. We, on the other hand, adapted. Soviet military doctrine had always emphasized flexibility and improvisation. We were not as well equipped as the Germans, not as well trained in the formal sense, but we were better at making do with what we had. We invented new tactics on the fly, learning from each battle and passing on what worked to other units. We developed the storm group concept, the close quarters fighting techniques, the use of sewers and basements and rooftops. We became the world's experts in urban warfare, writing the textbook without blood. And we held. Against all logic, against all odds, we held. The city fell around us, building by building, but we never stopped fighting. We retreated when we had to, counterattacked when we could, and always kept killing Germans. We made them pay for every meter in blood. We made Stalingrad into a wound that bled the German army white. When the counteroffensive came in November, when Soviet forces swept around the flanks and trapped the Sixth Army inside the city, the trap that closed around the Germans was our vindication. All those months of suffering, all those comrades lost, all that blood spilled, it had been for something. We had held the Germans in place while the hammer was being forged, and now the hammer fell.
The last weeks of the battle, from the encirclement to the final surrender, were in some ways the hardest. The fighting continued, just as intense as before, but now we knew we were going to win. Victory was certain. The only question was how long it would take and how many more would die before the Germans accepted the inevitable. Every death in those final weeks seemed doubly tragic because it was so close to the end. To survive 5 months of hell and then die in the last days before victory, that was a cruelty almost too bitter to contemplate. Yet men kept dying. The Germans, trapped and starving and frozen, fought with the desperation of cornered animals. They knew what awaited them if they surrendered. The propaganda had told them that the Bolsheviks tortured and murdered prisoners. Many preferred to die fighting rather than face that fate. So they counterattacked with suicidal fury, sacrificing themselves to hold positions for a few more hours, a few more days. We killed them. We killed them by the hundreds, by the thousands. We showed no mercy, because we had none left to give. The hatred that had accumulated over months of fighting, over years of German invasion and atrocity, demanded payment. Every German we killed was payment for a friend lost, a village burned, a family destroyed. The blood debt was enormous, and we collected on it with interest. I killed my last German on January 30th, 1943, 2 days before the final surrender. He was an officer, a major or colonel, judging by his insignia, though his uniform was so dirty and tattered that it was hard to tell. He was leading a counterattack against our position, a futile attempt to break through our lines and escape the encirclement. We cut down most of his men with machine gun fire, but he kept coming, pistol in hand, screaming orders in German. I shot him at close range, 2 rounds to the chest. He fell forward, landing at my feet, his blood pooling on the frozen ground. I looked down at him and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no triumph, no guilt. Just the empty finality of another death in a war that had produced millions of them. When the surrender finally came, it was almost anticlimactic. One moment we were fighting, and the next white flags were appearing everywhere. German soldiers emerged from their positions with their hands raised, their faces gaunt and hopeless. They formed long columns and marched toward the prisoner collection points, guarded by Soviet soldiers who a few hours earlier had been trying to kill them. I watched them go,
and thought about what they had done to my country. The burnt villages, the murdered civilians, the attempted enslavement of an entire nation. And now here they were, defeated and broken, their great army reduced to a shuffling column of starving wretches. The master wraith brought low by the Untermensch they had come to conquer. There should have been satisfaction in that. There should have been joy and victory, triumph in the vindication of everything we had suffered for. But I felt nothing except exhaustion. The battle was over, but something in me was over too. Something had been burnt out of me by the crucible of Stalingrad, and it would never grow back. I survived the Stalingrad Red War. That is what this account is supposed to be about, so let me state it clearly. I survived. Against all odds, against all logic, against all probability, I emerged from that city alive when so many others did not. I ate rats and drank contaminated water and slept in cellars full of corpses. I killed men and watched friends die and witnessed horrors that no human being should ever witness. And I survived. But survival is not the same as living. I carried Stalingrad with me for the rest of my life, a weight that never lifted, a shadow that never dispersed. The nightmares, the memories, the faces of the dead, they became permanent residents in my mind, as much a part of me as my own heartbeat. I survived Stalingrad, but part of me never left those ruins. Part of me is still there, fighting and dying and killing in an endless loop that only stops when I stop. I am an old man now. The war ended 80 years ago. The Soviet Union I fought for no longer exists. Most of the people I fought alongside are dead. But I remember everything. And I write it down so that others will remember too. The Battle of Stalingrad was a turning point in human history. Before Stalingrad, Hitler seemed invincible. His armies had conquered most of Europe. His ideology seemed destined to dominate the world. After Stalingrad, everything changed. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. The tide of the war began to turn. A long road to Berlin began. But that is the historian's perspective. From where I stood, in the rubble and the blood and the chaos, there was no turning point. There was only survival. One more hour, one more day, one more petal. That was all we thought about. That was all we could think about. The grand strategic picture, the sweep of history, the significance of our struggle, all of that was meaningless to men fighting for their lives in the ruins of a city that had become a charnel house. What I learned at Stalingrad was simple. Human beings are capable of enduring almost anything. We can survive cold and hunger and fear and pain beyond what we think possible. We can watch our friends die and keep fighting. We can kill without feeling and die without complaint. We can descend into hell and somehow find a way to keep going. But we pay a price. The men who survived Stalingrad were not the same men who entered it. Something was taken from us. Innocence, perhaps, or hope, or the capacity for simple joy. Something was burnt away by the fire of that baton, leaving only ash and scar tissue where there had once been whole human beings. I survived the Stalingrad Red War, but sometimes I wonder if survival was really a victory at all. This is my story. This is my testimony. This is what I saw and did and survived. I write it down not for glory or recognition, but because the dead deserve to be remembered, all of them, Soviet and German, soldier and civilian, friend and enemy. They all had names. They all had lives. They all had people who loved them. And they all died in that cursed city, fighting over rubble that is now forgotten, in a war that ended decades ago. Remember them. Remember us. Remember Stalingrad. Because there is no land for us beyond the Volga, and there is no escape from memory.